Before we dive into this incredible story of how America survived its darkest hour, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these forgotten chapters of history to life. Confined between ridges 3 miles apart, the Susquehanna River, for a little more than 20 miles, winds through the valley of Wyoming. Abrupt rocks, rent by tributary streams, rise on the east, while the western slopes are luxuriantly fertile. Connecticut, whose charter from Charles II was older than that of Pennsylvania, used its prior claim to lands north of the Mamaroneck River to colonize this beautiful region and govern it as its county of Westmoreland. The settlements, begun in 1754, increased in numbers and wealth till their annual tax amounted to 2,000 pounds in Connecticut currency. In the winter of 1776, the people aided Washington with 2 companies of infantry, though their men were all needed to protect their own homes. Knowing the alliance of the British with the Six Nations, they built a line of 10 forts as places of refuge. The Seneca tribe kept fresh in memory their chiefs and braves who fell in the conflict with the New York husbandmen at Oriskany. Their king, Susin-Jarocton, was both in war and in council the foremost man in all the Six Nations. Compared with him, the Mohawk Brant, who had been but very lately known upon the warpath, was lightly esteemed. His attachment to the English increased to a passion on the alliance of America with the French, for whom he cherished implacable hate. Through his interest and by the blandishments of gifts and pay and chances of revenge, Colonel John Butler lured the Seneca warriors to cross the border of Pennsylvania under the British flag. The party of savages and rangers, numbering between 500 and 700 men, fell down the Tioga River and on the last day of June hid in the forests above Wyoming. The next day, the 2 northernmost forts capitulated. The men of Wyoming, old and young, with 1 regular company, in all hardly more than 300, took counsel with one another and found no hope of deliverance for their families but through a victorious encounter with a foe of twice their number and more skillful in the woods than themselves. On the 3rd of July, the devoted band, led by Colonel Zebulon Butler, who had just returned from the Continental Service, began their march up the river. The horde of invaders, pretending to retreat, crouched themselves on the ground in an open wood. The villagers of Wyoming began firing as they drew near, and at the 3rd volley stood within 100 yards of the ambush, when the Seneca braves rose to the attack and were immediately seconded by the Rangers. The Senecas gave no quarter, and in less than half an hour took 225 scalps, among them those of 2 field officers and 7 captains. The Rangers saved the lives of but 5 of their captives. On the British side, only 2 whites were killed and 8 Indians wounded. The next day, the remaining forts, filled chiefly with women and children, capitulated. The long and wailing procession of survivors, fleeing from their fields of corn, their gardens, the flames of their cottages, the unburied bodies of their beloved defenders, escaped by a pass through the hills to the eastern settlements. Every fort and dwelling was burnt. The Senecas roamed over the surrounding country, adepts in murder and devastation. The British leader boasted in his report that his party had burnt 1,000 houses and every mill. Germain, in reply, extolled their prowess and even their humanity, and resolved on directing a succession of similar parties to waste the older settlements, but not to recover and hold them. The ancient affection for England was washed out in blood. After the retreat of the British, the government of Pennsylvania, as well as that of New Jersey, used the right of bringing to trial those of their citizens who had been false to their allegiance. But Livingston, the governor of New Jersey, pardoned every one of 17 who were found guilty. At Philadelphia, against his intercession, 2 men, one of whom had conducted a British party to a midnight carnage, were convicted and suffered on the gallows. Regret prevailed that these had not in like manner been forgiven.
Before the treaties of alliance had been signed, Vergennes wrote that it was almost physically impossible for the English to wrest independence from the Americans, that all efforts, however great, would be powerless to recall a people so thoroughly determined to refuse submission. On the side of the sea, from Nova Scotia to Florida, the British occupied no posts except the island of Rhode Island and New York City with its environs. The British were as yet at Ogdensburg, Niagara, and Detroit, but the Americans held the country from the highlands to the watershed of Lake Ontario. The love and the exercise of individual liberty, though they hindered the efficiency of government, made the Americans unconquerable. They looked beyond danger to the enjoyment of peace in a family and country of their own. Their service in the camp exalted their character. They knew that they were suffering not for their own land only, but for the benefit of the human race. Moreover, the inmost mind of the American people had changed. The consciousness of a national life had dissolved the sentiment of loyalty to the Crown of England. In England, a similar revolution had taken place. The insurgents, losing the name of rebels, began to be called Americans. Officers returning from the war said openly that no person of judgment conceived the least hope that the colonies could be subjected by force. Some British statesmen thought to retain a political or at least a commercial connection, while many were willing to give them up unconditionally. Even before the surrender of Burgoyne, Gibbon, a member of the Board of Trade, confessed that though England had sent to America the greatest force which any European power ever ventured to transport into that continent, it was not strong enough to attack its enemy, nor to prevent them from receiving assistance. The war measures of the administration were therefore so repugnant to sound policy that they ceased to be right. After that surrender, he agreed that since the substance of power was lost, the name of independence might be granted to the Americans. General Howe coupled his retirement from active service with the avowal that the disposable resources of his country could produce no decisive result. "Things go ill and will not go better," wrote the chief of the new commission for establishing peace. Sir Henry Clinton, the successor of Howe, reported himself too weak to attempt the restoration of the king's authority. Lord George Germain had no plan for the coming campaign but to lay the colonies waste. Lord North, who had been at the head of affairs from 1770, owned in anguish the failure of his system and deplored its continuance. Should the Americans ratify the French alliance, Lord Amherst, who was the guide of the ministry in the conduct of the war, recommended the evacuation of New York and Rhode Island and the employment of the troops against the French West Indies. But the radical change of opinion was shown most clearly by the votes of Parliament. In February 1774, the House of Commons, in a moment of unrestrained passion, adopted measures for enforcing the traditional absolutism of Parliament by majorities of 3-1. Corresponding majorities in February 1778 reversed its judgment, repealed the punitive acts, and conceded everything which the colonies had demanded. There was a general cry for peace. The king, in January 1778, confessed to Lord North that the time may come when it will be wise to abandon all North America but Canada, Nova Scotia, and the Floridas. But then the generality of the nation must see it first in that light. Lord Rockingham was convinced and desired to convince the public of the impossibility of going on with the war. On the 2nd of February, Fox spoke against its continuance and was heard with favor, and on the division several Tories voted with him. English opinion had by this time resigned itself to the belief that the United States could not be reduced. Fox would have had England instantly declare their independence. Pownall, who had once defended the Stamp Act, urged their recognition. Conway, breaking through his reserve, said in Parliament that it has been proved to demonstration that there is no other method of having peace with them but acknowledging them to be what they really are and what they are determined to remain, independent states. The House of Commons seemed secretly to agree with him. Tories began to vote against the ministry. The Secretary of War, Lord Barrington, said to the king that the opinion that the administration is not equal to the times prevails even among those who are most dependent on the ministers and most attached to them. Nay, it prevails among the ministers themselves. Lord North was convinced of the ruinous tendency of his measures and professed, but only professed, an earnest wish to resign office. Lord Mansfield deplored the danger of a war with both houses of the Bourbons. The landed aristocracy were grown weary of the conflict, of which the continuance promised only increasing taxation and a visible loss of national dignity and importance. So long as there remained a hope of recovering America, the ministers were supported, for they alone would undertake its reduction. The desire to replace them with statesmen more worthy of a great people implied the consent to peace on the basis of American independence. To that end, all elements conspired.
On the 2nd of July, the President and several members of Congress met once more in Philadelphia. On the 9th, the Articles of Confederation, engrossed on parchment, were signed by 8 states. On the 10th, Congress issued a circular to the other 5, urging them to conclude the glorious compact which was to unite the strength, wealth, and counsels of the whole. North Carolina acceded on the 21st, Georgia on the 24th. New Jersey demanded for the United States the regulation of trade and the ownership of the ungranted Northwestern domain, but after unassisted efforts for a more efficient union, the state on the 25th of the following November accepted the Confederacy without amendment. On the 5th of May 1779, the delegates of Delaware did the same. Maryland alone arrested the consummation of the Confederation by demanding that the public lands northwest of the Ohio should first be recognized as the common property of all the states and held as a common resource to discharge the debts contracted by Congress for the expenses of the war. On the 8th of July, the French fleet, consisting of 12 ships of the line and 3 frigates, after a rough voyage of nearly 90 days from Toulon, anchored in the Bay of Delaware, 10 days too late to intercept the inferior squadron of Lord Howe and its crowd of transports on their retreat from Philadelphia. The Count d'Estaing had persuaded Marie Antoinette to propose the expedition, of which he became the admiral. On the 11th, Congress learned from his letters that he was ready to cooperate with the states in the reduction of the British Army and Navy. This first invitation to a concert of measures revealed that the American people, for want of an organized government, could do no more than empower Washington to call upon the 6 states north of the Delaware for aids of militia, while its financial measure was a popular loan to be raised throughout the country by volunteer collectors. D'Estaing followed his enemy to the north and anchored within Sandy Hook, where he intercepted unsuspecting British ships bound for New York. The fleet of Lord Howe was imperfectly manned, but his fame attracted from merchant vessels and transports a full complement of volunteers. The French fleet desired, nevertheless, to sail up the bay and offer battle, but no pilots could be found to take its largest ships through the channel. Since New York could not be reached, D'Estaing, ignorant of the secret agreement between France and Spain, indulged the dream of annexing British Newfoundland to the American Republic as a 14th state with representation in Congress. Washington proposed to employ the temporary superiority at sea in the capture of Rhode Island and its garrison of 6,000 men. He had in advance summoned Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island to send quotas of their militia for the expedition. The Council of War of Rhode Island, exceeding his requirement, called out 1/2 of the effective force of the state for 20 days from the 1st of August and ordered the remainder to be ready at a minute's warning. Out of his own feeble army, he spared 1 brigade from Massachusetts and 1 from Rhode Island, of 1,000 each, and they were followed by a further detachment. Directing Sullivan, who was placed over the district of Rhode Island, to throw the American troops into 2 divisions, he sent Greene to command the one and Lafayette the other. Young Laurens served D'Estaing as aide and interpreter. On the 29th of July, while Clinton was reporting to Germain that he would probably be under the necessity of evacuating New York and retiring to Halifax, the French fleet, with 3,500 land troops on board, appeared off Newport, and the British saw themselves forced to destroy 10 or more armed ships and galleys carrying 212 guns. The country was palpitating with joy at the alliance with France.
Congress, on Sunday, the 6th of August, with studied ceremony, gave its audience of reception to Conrad Alexander Girard, the French plenipotentiary, listened to his assurances of the affection of his king for the United States and for each one of them, and acknowledged the hand of a gracious providence in raising them up so powerful a friend. Robert Livingston expressed the hope that Congress, in treating for peace, would insist on the independence of Canada, Hudson's Bay, the Floridas, and all the continent.
On the 8th, the French fleet, which a whim of Sullivan had detained for 10 days in the offing, ran past the British batteries into the harbor of Newport. The landing had been concerted for the 10th, but learning that the British outposts on the north of the island had been withdrawn, Sullivan, on the morning of the 9th, without notice to D'Estaing, crossed with his troops from the side of Tiverton. Scarcely had he done so when the squadron of Lord Howe, which had been reinforced from England, was seen to anchor near Point Judith. On the 10th, a strong wind rising from the northeast, D'Estaing, by advice of his officers, among whom were Suffren and de Grasse, bore down upon the British squadron in order of battle. While D'Estaing was baffled in the attempt to force an action, the wind increased to a hurricane and wrecked and scattered both fleets. The French ship Languedoc lost its rudder and masts. The Apollo, to which the British admiral had shifted his flag, could not keep at sea. The same storm flooded Rhode Island with rain, damaged the ammunition of the American army, overturned their tents, and left them no shelter except trees and fences. Horses were killed, and even soldiers perished. The British troops, being quartered in the town, suffered less, and on the return of fair weather, Piggott, but for his inertness, might have fallen upon a defenseless enemy. The squadron of Lord Howe steered for Sandy Hook. D'Estaing, 3 of whose ships had severally encountered 3 English ships, appeared on the 20th within sight of Newport, but only to announce that he was compelled to sail for Boston for repairs and supplies. In general orders, Sullivan censured D'Estaing and insinuated the inutility of the French alliance, and then, under compulsion from Lafayette, in other general orders made reparation. Washington sent him timely and incessant messages to withdraw from the island, yet he persisted in raising on Honeyman's Hill batteries which were too remote to be of use. The retreat, which was conducted in the presence of regular troops superior in numbers, was delayed till the night of the 28th. The next day, the British attempted to get round the American right wing and cut off every chance of escape. On that side, Greene, supported by young Lawrence, changed the defense into an attack and drove the enemy in disorder and with loss back to their strong post on Quaker Hill. On the night following the 30th, the army of Sullivan, evading its pursuers, escaped from the island. Clinton, with a reinforcement of 4,000 men, landed the next day. He soon returned to New York, having accomplished nothing except that a detachment under Gray set fire to the shipping in New Bedford and then levied cattle and money on the farmers of Martha's Vineyard. Lord Howe gave up the naval command to Admiral Byron and was not again employed in America. Washington, in August, as he came again upon White Plains, wrote to a friend in Virginia that after 2 years' maneuvering and the strangest vicissitudes, both armies are brought back to the very point they set out from, and the offending party at the beginning is now reduced to the use of the spade and pickaxe for defense. The hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more than wicked that has not gratitude to acknowledge his obligations. Governor Trumbull of Connecticut expressed the belief of his state when he said that in the series of marvelous occurrences during the present war, he must be blind who does not see the divine ordering thereof. On the 3rd of October, the commissioners for restoring peace to the colonies addressed a farewell manifesto to the Congress, assemblies, and other inhabitants of America, that their persistence in separating from Great Britain would change the whole nature and future conduct of this war, that the extremes of war should so distress the people and desolate the country as to make them of little avail to France. Congress published the paper in the Gazettes to convince the people of the insidious designs of the commissioners. In the British House of Commons, Coke of Norfolk proposed to disavow the declaration. Lord George Germain insisted that the Americans, by their alliance, were become French and should be treated as Frenchmen. Burke pointed out that the dreadful menace was pronounced against those who, conscious of rectitude, stood up to fight for freedom and country. The Commissioner Johnston, who, in changing sides on the American question, had not tamed the fury of his manner, said no quarter ought to be shown to their Congress, and if the infernals could be let loose against them, I should approve of the measure. The proclamation certainly does mean a war of desolation. It can mean nothing else. Gibbon divided silently with the Friends of America, who had them the judgment, though not the vote, of the House. 3 days later, Rockingham in the House of Lords denounced the accursed manifesto and declared that since the coming of Christ, war had not been conducted on such inhuman ideas. Lord Suffolk, in reply, appealed to the bench of bishops, on which the Bishop of Peterborough, tracing the resemblance between the proclamation and the acts of Butler at Wyoming, added, "There is an article in the Extraordinaries of the Army for scalping knives. Great Britain defeats any hope in the justness of her cause by means like these to support it."
The debate closed well for America, except that Lord Shelburne was provoked into saying that he never would serve with any man who would consent to its independence. The British Army under Clinton could only ravage and destroy by sudden expeditions. Toward the end of September, Cornwallis led a foray into New Jersey, and Major General Gray, with a party of infantry, surprising Baylor's light horse, used the bayonet mercilessly against men that sued for quarter. A band led by Captain Patrick Ferguson in October, after destroying the shipping in Little Egg Harbor, spread through the neighboring country to burn the houses and waste the lands of the Patriots. On the night of the 15th, they surprised light infantry under Pulaski's command and, cumbering themselves with no prisoners, killed all they could. In November, a large party of Indians with bands of Tories and regulars entered Cherry Valley by an unguarded pass and, finding the fort too strong to be taken, murdered and scalped more than 30 of the inhabitants, most of them women and children. Immediately after the General Declaration of Independence, the citizens of South Carolina, by common consent, entrusted constituent powers to their representatives. In January 1777, a bill for a new constitution was introduced. The Senate was to be chosen by the electors in the several parishes. The distribution of the representation in the General Assembly was left unchanged. The bill was printed and submitted for examination to the people for more than a year. The legislature in March 1778 gave it their sanction, and it was then presented to the President for confirmation. Everyone expected that in a few hours it would be proclaimed when Rutledge, the outgoing president, called the Council and Assembly into the council chamber and, after a formal speech, gave it a negative because it took from the chief of the executive his veto power. The majority determined to vote no taxes until the veto should be reversed. After a 3 days adjournment, which was required by the rules before a rejected bill could be again brought forward, Rawlins Lowndes, the newly elected president, gave his sanction to the reenacted bill. The new Constitution might be altered by legislative authority after a notice of 90 days. None but freeholders could elect or be elected to office, and for the higher offices, the possession of a large freehold was required. In any redistribution of the representation of the state, the number of white inhabitants and the amount of taxable property were to be considered. The veto power was taken from the president. Till this time, the Church of England had been the established church in South Carolina. The Christian Protestant Church was now declared to be the established religion of the state, and none but Protestants were eligible to high executive or any legislative office. The right of suffrage was conferred exclusively on every free white man who, having the requisite age and freehold, acknowledged God and a future state of rewards and punishments. All persons who so believed, and that God is publicly to be worshipped, might form religious societies. The support of religious worship was voluntary.
The property, then belonging to societies of the Church of England or any other religious societies, was secured to them in perpetuity. The people were to enjoy forever the right of electing their own pastors or clergy, but the state was entitled to security for the due discharge of the pastoral office by the persons so elected. Of slaves or slavery, no mention was made except by implication. The Constitution having been adopted on the 19th of March 1778 to go into effect on the following 29th of November, all resident free male persons in the state above 16 years refusing to take the oath to maintain it against the King of Great Britain and all other enemies were exiled. But a period of 12 months after their departure was allowed them to dispose of their property. In October 1778, after the intention of the British to reduce South Carolina became known, death was made the penalty for refusing to depart from the state or for returning without permission. At this time, the British ministry, resigning the hope of reducing the North, indulged the expectation of conquering all the states south of the Susquehanna. For this end, the British commander-in-chief at New York was ordered to dispatch before October, if possible, 1,000 men to reinforce Pensacola and 3,000 to take Savannah. 2 more were destined as a reinforcement to St. Augustine.
The new policy was inaugurated by remonstrances from the highest British officials in America and was followed by never-ending complaints. Lord Carlisle and his associate commissioners deprecated the policy of enfeebling New York by detachments for distant services. Under these appearances of weakness, so they reported, our cause has visibly declined. Sir Henry Clinton remonstrated against being a mournful witness of the debility of his army reduced to a starved defensive. Every detachment for the Southern campaign was made with sullen reluctance, and his indirect criminations offended the unforgiving minister. The use of paper money by the Americans and its ever-accelerated depreciation and the want of a central government revived the hope of subjugating them. The United States closed the campaign of 1778 before autumn for want of money. Paper bills, emitted by Congress on its pledge of the faith of each separate state, supported the war in its earliest period. Their decline was hastened by the disasters that befell the American armies. Their value was further impaired by the ignoble stratagem of the British ministers, under whose authority Lord Dunmore and others introduced into the circulation of Virginia and other states a large number of bills counterfeited for the purpose in England. In October 1776, Congress, which possessed no independent resources and no powers on which credit could be founded, opened loan offices in the several states and authorized a lottery. In December, it issued $5 million more in Continental bills. In January 1777, when they had sunk to 1/2 of their pretended value, it denounced every person who would not receive them at par as a public enemy liable to forfeit whatever he offered for sale, and it requested the state legislatures to declare them a lawful tender. This Massachusetts had enacted a month before, and the example was followed throughout the Union. The loan offices exchanged United States paper money at par for certificates of debt bearing 6% interest. On a hint from Arthur Lee, Congress resolved to pay this interest by drawing on its commissioners in Paris for coin, though the commissioners had no funds. The bills were of a very long date, and before they became due, $1 in coin was worth 6 in paper. In the middle of November 1776, Massachusetts, which had grown opulent before the war by tolerating no currency but hard money, proposed a convention of committees from the several New England states to consider all questions relating to public credit. Connecticut feared the measure would give umbrage to Congress. Upon this, a convention of the New England states, called by Rhode Island under the name of a Council of War, met on Christmas Day at Providence. They regulated prices, proposed taxation and loans, and recommended that the states should issue no more paper unless in extreme cases. Congress liked their doing so well that in January 1777 it advised similar conventions of the middle and of the three southernmost states. Striving for the monopoly of paper money, it asked the states to call in their bills and to issue no more. All the measures hitherto suggested having failed of their object, Massachusetts once more took the lead, and on her invitation the four New England states and New York met near the end of July at Springfield on the Connecticut. With one voice they found the root of all financial difficulties in the use of irredeemable paper. As the only remedy, they proposed to sink all bills of the states and to provide alike for their local expenses and those of the war by quarterly taxes. Their example showed how readily the people of the states could come together by their delegates for the purpose of reforming the government. Prices rose and bills went down with accelerated speed.
The anxious deliberations of the Committee of Congress during more than 2 months at Yorktown, with the report of the Springfield Convention before them, produced only a recommendation adopted in November 1777 that the several states should become creditors of the United States by raising for the Continental Treasury $5 million in 4 quarterly installments, the first payment to be made on the coming New Year's Day and the whole to bear 6% interest until the final adjustment of accounts after the Confederation should have been ratified. Massachusetts was rated at $820,000, Virginia at $800, Pennsylvania at $620, Connecticut at $600, New York, rent and ravaged by the war, at $200, Delaware and Georgia each at $60. A general wish prevailed to respect the recommendation, but most of the states retained their quotas to reimburse themselves for advances, and besides, they were all weighed down by expenses and obligations of their own. Shadowy hopes of foreign loans rose before Congress. In December 1777, in advance of treaties of commerce and alliance, the American commissioners in France and Spain were instructed to borrow £2 million to be repaid in 10 years, and in February 1778, the commissioner for Tuscany was charged to borrow half as much more, yet the Grand Duke of Tuscany would have no relations with the United States, and no power was so ill-disposed toward them as the King of Spain. To the American people, Congress wrote in May that the reasons that your money has depreciated are because no taxes have been imposed to carry on the war, but they did not as yet venture to ask power to levy taxes. On obtaining the King of France for their ally, they authorized drafts on their commissioners in Paris for 31.5 millions of livres at 5 livres to the dollar in payment of loan office certificates, leaving Franklin and his colleagues to meet the bills of exchange as they could. Of continental bills, $5 million were issued in May, as many more in June, and as many more in July. In August, Congress devoted 2 days in the week to the consideration of its finances, but with no better result than to order $5 million in paper in the first week of September and $10 million more in the last. Certificates of the loan offices were used in great amounts in payment to debts to the separate states, especially to Pennsylvania. The legalized use of paper money spread its never-failing blight. Trade became a game of hazard. Unscrupulous debtors discharged contracts of long standing in bills worth perhaps but 1/20th of their nominal value. The unwary ran in debt, while cunning creditors waited for payment till the continental bills should cease to be a legal tender. The name of Richard Price was dear to every lover of political freedom. He derived his theory of morals from eternal and immutable principles, and his essay on liberty, which was read in Great Britain, America, and through a translation in Germany, founded the rights of man on the reality of truth and justice. He had devised a scheme for the payment of the British debt. Congress, on the 6th of October, invited him to become their fellow citizen and to regulate their finances. The invitation was declined by their illustrious friend, but he gave the assurance that he looked upon the United States as now the hope and soon to become the refuge of mankind.
From this time, Congress saw no resource but in such very considerable loans or subsidies in Europe as could be expected only from an ally, and before the end of October they instructed Franklin to assure His Most Christian Majesty they hoped protection from his power and magnanimity. There were those in Congress who would not place their country under protection, but the word was retained by 8 states against Rhode Island and Maryland. Samuel Adams and Lovell of Massachusetts voted for it, but were balanced by Gerry and Holton. Sherman of Connecticut opposed it, but his vote was neutralized by that of Ellsworth. The people of the United States, in proportion to their numbers, were more opulent than the people of France, but the pride that would not consent to an efficient union was willing to ask protection.
The country was looking to the United Provinces for aid, and in December, Laurens retired from the office of President of Congress in the expectation of being appointed to negotiate a loan in the Netherlands. Till money could be borrowed, paper was the only resource, and the wants of November and December required an emission of rather more than 20 millions. The debt of the United States in currency and in certificates was estimated at 140 millions. The Continental bills already exceeded 106 millions of dollars and had fallen in value to 20 for 1 in silver. Yet Congress maintained the certainty of their redemption and resolved, Samuel Adams and 6 others dissenting, that any contrary report was false and derogatory to its honor. To make good the promise, the states were invited to withdraw 6 millions of paper dollars annually for 18 years, beginning with the year 1780. The measure was carried by Pennsylvania and the states north of it against the southern states. The expenses of the year 1778, so far as they were defrayed by Congress, amounted to 62 1/6 millions in paper money, besides more than $84,000 in specie. Toward the expenses of the coming year, nothing further was done than to invite the states to contribute 15 millions in paper, equal in specie to $700,000. But as the payments depended on the goodwill of each separate state, very little of this moderate assessment reached the national treasury, and there was no resource but in new emissions of notes and loan certificates. Private reports from American refugees seeking the favor of the King of England persuaded Germain that the cause of the United States would share the wreck of their finances, but he knew not how to conciliate provinces that were weary of war, nor to measure the tenacity of the passive resistance of a determined people, and he systematically sought to subdue them by terror. The refugees, emboldened by the powerlessness of Congress and embittered by its advice to the several states to confiscate their property, thronged the antechamber of the minister to fire his vengeful passions by their own. In New York, there sprang up a double set of counselors. Clinton repressed the confidence of the Secretary of State by faithful reports of the inadequacy of his army. On the other hand, William Franklin, late governor of New Jersey, aiming at the power and emoluments to be derived from an appointment as the head of a separate organization of loyalists, proposed as no difficult task to reduce and retain one of the middle provinces by hanging or exiling all its rebels and confiscating their estates for the benefit of the friends to government. Wiser partisans of Great Britain reprobated the desire of continuing the war for the sake of war, and foretold that should the mode of devastation be adopted, the friends of government must bid adieu to all hopes of ever again living in America. The British gained numerous recruits from immigrants. Cultivated men of the Roman Church gave hearty support to the cause of independence, but the great mass of its members, who were then but about 1 in 75 of the population of the United States and were chiefly newcomers in the Middle States, followed the influence of the Jesuits, in whose hands the direction of the Catholics of the United States still remained, and who cherished hatred of France for her share in the overthrow of their order. In Philadelphia, Howe had been able to form a regiment of Roman Catholics. With still better success, Clinton courted the Irish as Irishmen. They had fled from rack-renting landlords to a country which offered them freeholds. By flattering their nationality and their sense of the importance attached to their numbers, Clinton allured them, alike Catholics and Protestants, to a combination directly adverse to their own interests, and raised for Lord Rawdon a large regiment in which officers and men, including nearly 500 deserters from the American Army, were exclusively Irish.
Yet the British general lagged far behind the requirements of Germain, who counted upon 10,000 provincial levies and wished a manner of war better calculated to make the people feel their distresses. The king believed that the colonies must soon sue to the mother country for pardon, but Clinton, obeying peremptory instructions, before the end of the year most reluctantly detached 3,000 men for the conquest of Georgia and 10 regiments for service in the West Indies. His supplies of meat and bread, for which he depended on Europe, were precarious. His military chest was empty, and the inhabitants of New York, mindful of the hour when the city would be given up, were unwilling to lend him their specie. "I do not complain," so he wrote in December to the Secretary of State, "but, my lord, do not let anything be expected of one circumstanced as I am." On the other hand, America, notwithstanding the want of efficient government, set no narrow bounds to its aspirations. Samuel Adams, uttering the popular sentiment, wrote from Philadelphia, "I hope we shall secure to the United States Canada, Nova Scotia, Florida too, and the fishery by our arms or by treaty. We shall never be on a solid footing till Great Britain cedes to us or we wrest from her what nature designs we should have." From Boston, D'Estaing, in the name of his king, had summoned the Canadians to throw off British rule. Lafayette, in December, exhorted his children, the savages of Canada, to look upon the English as their enemies. Thus encouraged, Congress, without consulting a single military man, formed a plan for the emancipation of Canada in cooperation with an army of France. One American detachment from Pittsburgh was to capture Detroit, another from Wyoming, Niagara, a third from the Mohawk River to seize Oswego, a fourth from New England by way of the St. Francis to enter Montreal, a fifth to guard the approaches from Quebec, while to France was assigned the office of reducing Quebec and Halifax. Lafayette would willingly have used his influence at Versailles in favor of the enterprise, but Washington showed how far the part reserved for the United States went beyond their resources. The spirit of independence grew in strength. In almost all parts of the country, the inhabitants were left to plow and plant, to sow and reap without fear. On the plantations of Virginia, the abundant products of labor were heaped up for exportation along the banks of her navigable waters. In all New England, seed time and harvest had not failed, and the ports of Massachusetts grew opulent by commerce. For want of a government, this boundless hope of a young and resolute people could have no support in organized forces. The army, of which the headquarters were at Middlebrook, was encamped for the winter so as to form a line of observation and defense from the Connecticut shore of Long Island Sound to the Delaware. For the convenience of forage, the 4 regiments of cavalry were distributed among the states from Connecticut to Virginia. The troops were hutted as at Valley Forge. They suffered extreme distress for want of food, but through importations from France, they were better clad than ever before. Officers in great numbers were quitting the service from absolute necessity, and those who remained were sinking into poverty, while the men grew restless and discontented. The Continental Congress, powerless to levy taxes, could only make requisitions upon the states, and the states, jealous of their sovereignty and exhausted by years of war, failed to meet those requisitions. The currency had depreciated to almost nothing. A soldier's pay would barely buy him a meal. Yet somehow, through sheer force of will and the leadership of Washington, the army held together. They had survived Valley Forge, they had proven themselves at Monmouth, they had the alliance with France, and they had something the British could never understand, something that no amount of military discipline could create. They were fighting for their own land, their own liberties, their own futures. That made all the difference. The war would drag on for years more, with victories and defeats, with suffering and sacrifice, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. America would be free. If this story of how America secured her independence through the alliance with France, through the leadership of Washington, and through the determination of ordinary men who became extraordinary soldiers resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the real stories of American history, the ones that shaped this nation, told without agenda, just the facts as they happened. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter in this remarkable story.